Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. Today I am joined by Samia Shaoib. Did I do that right?
Beautiful.
Samia Shaoib, a writer and Twitter personality, trained counselor, and soon to be published memoirist. Is that correct?
Inshallah, as we say.
And well, thanks for doing this.
Oh, you're welcome, Dean. My pleasure.
You are the Wacky Packy on Twitter.
Yes.
Have you been on Twitter long?
I have. I joined Twitter during the Arab Spring, which I mean, how could I not, right? It was all unfolding on Twitter. So I've been on there a very long time, and I found it to be very therapeutic most of the time. When I was drinking, it was a little dangerous. It was very tempting to get on there with a glass in my hand and just, pick fights with people. But experience has changed drastically post-sobriety. But I think it's a wonderful tool. I really do.
It's interesting. People complain about Twitter, but nobody complains as much about Twitter as people who are deep into Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's interesting because I've been on Twitter actively tweeting and writing and reading for probably 10 years. And over that time, it's become like inhabiting two worlds. Like you have your real world, and then you have what's going on Twitter.
Yeah.
And, and I've said this many times, that people who haven't made a real investment in Twitter really don't understand why those of us who have, why it means so much to us. Because, like you said, it's quite therapeutic. It's like a never-ending party in a way.
Yeah, it's always happening. I mean, you can and out, and the reach is extraordinary. I mean, I have Twitter communities in Pakistan, the UK, and the States, obviously. And I'm able to keep current with, I'll speak to my mother in Pakistan. She'll say, oh, the electricity's just gone. I'm like, I know. I heard on Twitter, I know when it's raining there. I feel like I'm keeping current with all the places.
Yeah, the reach thing is so amazing to me. I've been on Zoom calls with people who are Twitter mutuals, and they might be, say, in South Africa, and they're talking to me, and he'll pick up his phone and he'll say, well, yesterday you tweeted, and he'll read me a tweet that I wrote, and he's in South Africa, and I'm thinking, I literally wrote that as I was walking upstairs to go to bed. I wrote that on the stairs, just popped it off. And, someone on the other side of the world is reading it and talking to me about its impact. That's really an amazing thing.
Yes. Yes.
But you and I have not followed one another long, just a few months. And I don't know how we came into one another's orbit, but
I think my algorithm is very attuned to mental health Twitter, because that is something I find incredibly informative and frankly comforting, because I've been going through a difficult time personally, and I found quite a supportive community.
I follow many people in the same realm. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Jonathan Shedler, who is a professor at the University of California. But his tweets are so educational. I asked him once, how many of your tweets do I need to read before I get a master's degree? Right? Because it's almost like a lecture.
Yes, he has quite a cult following. He tweeted some virulently Islamophobic material. while there's an ongoing genocide in Gaza, which I thought was appalling behavior for someone who might have Muslim clients, not very responsible. And we had a little exchange that resulted in a blockage, a mutual blockage. So I
missed all that entirely.
It was very exciting. I'm sorry you missed it. I have serious reservations about about working mental health practitioners being too vocal on Twitter. I mean,
too vocal about political issues and that kind of thing.
Yes, and I actually think that you have to prioritize the possibility that client or patient, if you prefer, may look up your Twitter account, especially if you're dealing with someone with a personality disorder, or, and it could be a distracting aspect in your counseling relationship. I was, in my training, social media was an absolute no-no. But things have changed.
Sure.
The way that you conduct yourself, I think, is very responsible and educational. I just think in mental health Twitter, I see a lot of dysfunction amongst the working therapists. I think there's a proliferation of compassion fatigue. There's complaining about how trauma is over diagnosed, and
right.
I wouldn't want to see that from my therapist, quite frankly.
Yes, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've actually pushed back on some of that, because I do think that discourse, the trauma is overdone discourse, to me is a problem, because it implies the implication of that is that there is someone somewhere who has the authority to tell anyone, you or me or anyone else, that what we thought was traumatic was not, in fact, really traumatic.
Right.
And so, and second, it carries with it, I think, a denial about the nature of our society. And that many people who are thinking about trauma don't want to accept that we just live in a society that is highly traumatizing.
That's right.
And so I have pushed back on that. And I don't like that at all, that sort of trauma is overdone. And you see it at times from more culturally or politically conservative therapists who think somehow that that widespread talk about trauma indicates that people are weak or soft or something. And I just think that misses the mark so much. And it concerns me, because it seems to indicate, like, almost not even understanding what trauma is or what makes something traumatic.
Exactly. I've noticed that about you. I've noticed that you're extremely aware and respectful of conscientious about validating people's experience and feeling. And that is what mental health treatment should be about. The enormity of the original wound is irrelevant. It's how the individual has processed it, and what brain chemistry they're bringing to that experience. It's highly subjective. And if someone says they're traumatized, I mean, I agree that we throw the word around. And I think maybe, capital T, lowercase t might be a sufficient designation. But this concern that it's going to water down real trauma, such as witnessing a murder,
right,
or right, shows a real scarcity mindset in terms of the availability of compassion, right?
That's a great point.
Do we not have enough for every trauma?
Right. Yeah. So, just thinking in terms of working with people, if someone came to me and said, when I was 7 or 8 years old, I was playing in the yard and a bird feather floated out of the sky and landed on my shoulder, and that has traumatized me for all these years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, there might be a couple of ways of approaching that, but even then, I would not say, "Oh, come on, grow up,
right?
Be toughen up," right?
Yeah.
And I just feel like people who say that demonstrate that they just don't have the curiosity about other people's subjective lives to really counsel or to work with people in a healing capacity at all. Because the right thing to say is, "That's very interesting. Tell me more about that."
Yes. For me, it is the information that I get instantly from that is about how that person speaks to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And what I want to know then is, what are you denying yourself? What are you withholding compassion for yourself? There's more than enough to go around. And I think there's a fear that if we, going back to your point about the right wing like fear of fragility and encouraging weakness, frankly, I understand where that comes from, but I think the exact opposite is true. I think that when we show people compassion and create safety, we build strength. We may dull motivation, and that is something we should, find other ways to deal with.
Right.
But I don't think there is anything in the long term that is fortifying about withholding compassion. I think that's a myth.
In a recent episode of the Tucker Carlson show, he interviewed Mike Cernovich, who is a very famous Twitter personality.
Yeah.
And at one point they had an interchange, and Tucker was saying, you had a terrible childhood. How did you overcome that? He said this to Mike Cernovich, and Mike Cernovich said, "I just read a bunch of self-help books, that's all." And I thought, well, if you could overcome it by reading a bunch of self-help books, that was not trauma. Because if it were trauma, you wouldn't. The problem with being traumatized is not that you don't know what the self-help books say. It's that your unconscious has worked itself around in a way that you are unable to do what the self-help books say. So if you're able to read a self-help book and apply it, then you're then I would say you probably have a fairly low level of trauma, or at the very least, because your unconscious is not set there to undermine you. But Mike went on to say further that part of what made his childhood bad is that he was bullied. And then he said, when I was bullied, my father said to me, "Well, you're going to have to go learn martial arts." And so he went and learned martial arts. And this is what I think people don't understand. What makes childhood experiences, like say bullying, traumatic, is not that they were difficult or not difficult. It is whether or not you as a child have someone you can turn to who will attune to you enough to process it. So the very fact that Mike's dad was there that he could tell his dad, that his dad would look at him, that his dad could understand that this was a bad thing, that his dad would direct him into an activity that made him feel safer, built his strength, made him feel masculine, that he had a dad there who could do that. That is what keeps that bullying from becoming as traumatic as it could otherwise be. Real trauma is when a kid gets bullied and has no one.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that is the perfect segue to talk about child sexual abuse, because that is the area that we so often forget when we, as a society, discuss it, which is a relatively recent phenomenon.
Before we get into that, let's back up, because I know that your memoir is connected to that. So
yes.
Let's tell people a little bit about how you got where you are in your career and and all of that, and kind of tell people a little bit more about who you are. We kind of jumped in right into trauma and all this, and so let's give people context.
Sure. I was born in Pakistan, and my family moved to England, to London, when I was 4 years old. We were 3 children. I was the youngest, with 2 older brothers. Now, in Pakistan, my mother had a whole household full of staff to help out. In Pakistan, it's not uncommon for, relatively privileged people to have a driver, a cook, maid, nannies, a nanny for each child. Sounds very luxurious, but I assure you it's not. When you have to manage that, I've done it myself. It's no fun at all. I would rather not have any staff myself. But my mother was an immigrant, wife who had never driven a car, had never cooked, had never done any of those things. She grew up in Pakistan and British India when it was colonized. So she brought with her a male domestic who was 16 years old, in order to keep my unruly elder brothers in line, because they're crazy. I mean, my brothers are notoriously naughty and rambunctious, like many little boys. So it made sense to her to have a young male who was flexible, who was young enough to adjust to a new culture. And he did a great job. And he was very good with all of us. The problem was that he was sexually abusing me from the age of... Now, I was severely neglected. My mother has no problem admitting that today. And I understand she was really very overwhelmed. My father was a high-powered banker starting a bank. He worked absolutely crazy hours. So I understand that my mother was overwhelmed. And I mention this because it is so common for the sexually abused child to be in an environment where the adults don't have the resources to look after them. So I was at the mercy of this 16-year-old boy. And from the age of 4 to 11, he sexually abused me in the most extreme way. And I grew up with my primary caregiver also being my abuser. And I mean, as a child, this was my reality. Telling anyone was not an option.
Can you recall where you were with that emotionally during that time? I mean, did you live in constant fear, or was it so normalized that what was going on with you in that?
Well, this is a very good question, because unless you've experienced it, most people don't understand that let me just point out that we're born with a quarter of our brain developed. 75% of brain development takes place between birth and 5, right? So when he started abusing me, my brain was still connecting, synapses were forming. That became my normal, right? There was nothing, obviously it wasn't a pleasant experience. It was a traumatic experience, and I certainly didn't enjoy it. But I accepted it as a part of my life. And children are so resilient. We find ways to survive these things. We're incredibly resourceful. And I employed various techniques, not least disassociation, fantasy. I had a very elaborate system that as an adult I've had to learn to let go of. Hence the addiction. We'll get to that. So for me, it was simply the way life was. And I pretty much assumed that everyone else dealt with that. Now we come to a very important point, which is around silencing, right? I grew up in a conservative Muslim family. I don't want anyone to think that by any stretch this is an Islamic problem. But the fact is, in cultures, all cultures that are sexually conservative, children are very often shamed around sex, regardless of whether they're being sexually abused or not, right? The language to communicate what's happening to them isn't available and certainly not taught to them.
Do you recall between 4 and 11 whether you thought about telling people, or was it, like you said, just so normalized you didn't even think to mention it?
Telling people was 1,000% not an option.
Okay. And so did you want to tell people, though, and it was not an option, or did you not even think about telling people?
No, I didn't feel safe telling people. I had a mother who was very stressed out by her life as it was. It was in my own interests not to contribute to that stress. It was also a self-protective mechanism. And I must share with you that just last month, I had the first honest discussion with my mother about abuse. It's been 50 years, 50, right?
Wow. So I think the question I'm trying to get at is this. Between 4 and 11, sexual abuse was normalized for you. But surely you had some sense that it was in some way wrong.
No.
No, you don't think you had a sense that it was wrong?
No, I knew it was wrong.
Okay.
And I knew because sexuality in general was wrong.
Oh, I see. Okay.
If there was a kissing scene on Dallas, my mom would make us all avert our eyes and tut-tut. So I knew that sexual things carried shame. And I felt that shame. But I did not have the circumstances in which I could feel safe. Take the risk. The point I was getting to is that when I did tell my mother, and this is very relevant, she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And then for the next 2 hours, I comforted my mother. She didn't ask how it affected me. She didn't ask me how I dealt with it in counseling. She didn't ask me details about my experience. So I felt abandoned.
Now, when was this? Was this just last week?
Bear with me, because I'm getting to your point.
Okay.
I had an intuition as a child that if I spoke up, I would not be looked after. Would they have stopped the abuse? Perhaps, most likely, right? But emotionally, I was a lot safer imagining that a fantasy world in which if I only told them, they would love me and comfort me. But it turned out 50 years later, I really didn't get any comfort at all. And I waited until I was strong enough to stomach that, because I could not take the risk. So when I say telling was not an option, I mean that. And to this day, I would say I did the right thing.
Sure. And my questions are just to sort of flesh out for people listening why it wasn't an option. Right? So yeah, even though you kind of knew at some level that it was wrong, and you had to dissociate, etc., that is this sort of terrible experience. But there are many reasons why you can't tell.
Let me put it this way: the circumstances that allow for a child to be sexually abused rarely arise in a household where it is safe to tell.
Right. That's a great point. So you lived, how long did you live in London until you were 16?
We lived in London till I was 16. And during that time, incidentally, I had 4 abusers. You see, when you have been sexually abused at such a young age, this is very taboo to say. But you, I don't know if it's the circumstances, invite other abusers, or the fact is that when a child's sexuality is activated, as my therapist put it, the therapist who practically saved my life, if things are working properly, then there is a premature sexualization that takes place, and not the child enjoys it. But there is initiation into that world that I don't know if I had an energetic field that kind of screamed, abuse me. But I went on to be, I was abused by my Quran teacher, which is classic religious abuse.
Wow, yeah.
That was from about 7 or 8 till 12. I was abused by a teenage cousin who would spend weekends at our house and climb into my bed. And I was abused by a female cousin. And then I was raped on my first date at the age of 13. So, the world that I lived in was one of where abuse and exploitation and my body being colonized by others and having no one to protect me was my reality. I developed symptoms of, I would say, traits of borderline personality disorder as a result.
What are the borderline personality disorder?
I would
tell people what that means. I said, tell people what that means.
It is called a personality disorder. I would call it a trauma response, actually. It's mostly women who've been diagnosed with it until recently. Now we understand that men also suffer from it, probably in equal numbers. But men tend to be diagnosed as narcissists when they present with borderline symptoms. It's basically an difficulty of regulating your own emotions. And it comes with extreme rages, suicidal impulses. It's a mood disorder. And it is not genetic, and it's not chemical. And as I said, I call it a trauma response. And it's become very political, how we view and treat borderline. I was cured by an incredibly competent therapist. And most people outgrow borderline in their 50s anyway. But the therapeutic establishment stigmatizes it massively. And if you get institutionalized and it says that you have a borderline diagnosis on your chart, then all the nurses and the psychiatric staff will avoid you and be because the borderline can turn on you, and there's a lot of misogyny and stigma involved. And borderline people are very tricky to deal with. They're prone to black and white thinking, drama, cognitive distortions, double binds, the whole shebang. But they are also incredibly receptive to the right.
How do you think those things, those borderline traits, or those traits that when grouped together we call borderline personality disorder, how do you think they grow out of something like repeated sexual abuse as a defense mechanism? So, like, what's going on psychologically, internally for the victim,
right?
Who kind of sees, I don't even know how to phrase it, but let me phrase it imprecisely, who sees this kind of behavior as a bid for safety, which may not be precisely what's going on, but that's the way I can think to phrase it at the moment.
I would say that one of the very worst things that child sexual abuse does is it alienates the victim from themselves, right? You can no longer trust your responses, your reality, your connection to yourself is severed, right? So being able to regulate your own emotions when you don't know how to connect with you is virtually impossible, right? It causes the disassociation that is necessary to survive it. Means that you don't have access to yourself like most people, a normal person does. The other thing it does is, and now we're getting to something we touched on earlier, which is the importance of what happens after the abuse. When you feel that you live in a world where you are not worthy of protection, and you don't have a safe place to tell. And I think, as you get older, when you've been sexually abused as a child, this is something that really becomes very significant to you. It's the fact that you did not feel protected, and where were the adults who were entrusted with your care? And the rage, because, like when I was an alcoholic, I would have very bad rages. And my mother said to me recently, well, your brothers are still very angry about the way you behaved when you were drinking. And I'm like, I was really angry too. And now that you know my story, can you understand why I was so angry? I look back on it now and I have a lot of compassion for that part of me, because my response, I think, was healthy. I mean, it was dysfunctional in that it didn't get my needs met and it pushed people away. But it was also a perfectly proportionate response to a very extreme and unjust situation.
Absolutely.
Had I not gotten angry, what was the alternative? The alternative is saying that I deserve it. The alternative is saying that I deserve not to be protected. I had to become my own protector. And as a woman, the difference between when male children experience sexual abuse and female is that when they grow up, men go out into a world in which they generally can feel physically safe. Women don't. We continue to be in danger. So that kind of defensiveness, and granted, my rage was extreme at times, I would not describe it, however, as disproportionate.
Sure. For people who've been through that kind of experience, honestly, the only options that they have, in a way, are to be angry or to just die.
Thank you. I agree.
And so, of the two, being angry is the more appropriate and healthier response. So, from 4 to 11, you were abused by these 4 abusers. Did any of those abusers ever face any consequences for their behavior?
No. In fact, 2 of them are still welcome at family gatherings.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to report the other 2. And I went through the British system. The British police service has, CPS, Child Protective Services, has renewed their I shouldn't say renewed, launched efforts to get justice for survivors, and set up all kinds of special branches, etc. It was one of the worst experiences of my life being interviewed by them, and I decided not to proceed. I do not have very much anger towards my abusers. My abuser, it was not the job of my abusers to protect me. I'm very involved in trying to understand pedophilia and what could possibly inspire it. And you won't be surprised to hear that very often we're talking about fellow survivors who are untreated. In fact, the mothers who are most likely to put their children, unconsciously put their children in danger of child sexual abuse are also unhealed, if you will, survivors. So my anger is not towards them. I mean, what they did was atrocious, but they had their own issues. Mm-hmm. My anger is towards my family of origin, to be perfectly honest. And I'm sorry if any of them are watching this. I love them very much. Mm-hmm. Or I should say. I love them very much. But I had 2 elder brothers and 2 parents who none of whom to this day have put their arms around me and said, "We're so sorry that happened to you." Mm-hmm. And people really need to be educated about how to respond when a child or an adult speaks up. I mean, I can't tell you how many adults disassociate when I tell them. And I'm very vocal because I consider it, I have a mission to spread awareness. And I have no problem, as you can see, telling my own story in order to do so, because the shame is not mine.
That's important.
Yes. And I've overcompensated, I've overshared, and I probably still do. But I would rather do that than carry silence and send myself the message that there is something for me to be ashamed of, because there is.
What happened? Okay.
The vast majority of people, for whatever reason, disassociate when I tell them that I'm a survivor. I would say 9 out of 10.
What does that mean? What do you mean by that?
I can see them checking out. Their eyes get glazed over. They go blank. They don't know how to respond. I feel that it triggers some. Now, I'm not saying everyone I've told has been sexually abused themselves, but I think either it triggers their own childhood stuff, or they just find it too difficult to. 1 in 10 will shed a tear or 2 and give me a hug, which is so wonderful. It is so meaningful when that happens, and yet all too rare. And I think we need to educate people on what survivors need when they tell their story. And we very much need to tell our stories. Mm-hmm. Every time I tell my story, I give the shame back. I put it where it belongs.
What happened at 16?
My family moved to Los Angeles.
How'd that go?
Great. I loved it. I my element in the state. when I grew up in England, there was a great deal of very blatant racism. So I should add that I was dealing with a lot of racism on the streets and at school, and my elder brothers dealt with a fraction of the racism, but because women are an easier target.
Sure.
So America in those days, it was like, you're from where? I'd be like, Pakistan. They'd be like, where's that? I'd say, you go to, and you make a left, you know. Right. Very liberating kind of anonymity. I loved American openness, and I came into my own in this country. And 16 onwards, I was, sexual abuse free. So that was also a big change. I proceeded to develop a drinking problem. However,
you were in some movies.
I was, yes. We lived in Los Angeles. I went to undergrad at USC and then GW in DC. And then I ended up at Columbia doing my master's in film directing. I always acted because actually I found acting very therapeutic because having to access my emotions and being in an environment where I had permission to emote was exactly what I had lacked. So I ended up being asked to audition for a Broadway play, and I got it. Film school, and I ended up being in like one of the biggest shows on Broadway for 6 months. It was bizarre. I started at the top of my profession, and then I just kept getting work. In those days, there were very few Pakistani or Indian origin actresses working in the States. It was very restricted. But there were a handful of us, and I would see all the girls at every audition, and I did pretty well, I think.
Now you stopped.
Yes.
So you mentioned developing a drinking problem, and you mentioned stopping acting. Are those two things related?
Somewhat. Over time, the more toxic aspects of the profession became apparent to me. The need for external validation, which was not conducive to healing, if you will. The scarcity of work, the whole process of auditioning, and the high drama. Will I get it? Will I not get it? Will my life change tomorrow, or will it be the same? The highs and the lows. It was not mentally healthy at all. Simultaneously, what was happening to me was I spent my 20s trying to prove to myself that I had not been sexually abused.
Why would you do that?
A very important part, and I want to come back to that, how I did that.
Okay, and I want to hear why you would do that.
Yes. Well, I think you'll better when I tell you this bit that I skipped. When I was in college, I happened to catch an Oprah show. And Oprah, I think it was her very first show about child sexual abuse. She was a real pioneer on the subject, as you may recall. 1989, I think it was. And I watched 45 minutes of the show thinking, my goodness, these poor people, how do they live? How do they survive? How do they deal with that? And it was only 45 minutes in that I realized I was also a victim, because the other thing about something that you grow up with that is normalized is you never have to name it. So I have the pictures in my head like a movie. all the fragments, all the memories, but I had never put a name to them. So I remember going for the vodka bottle in my freezer. The minute I put two and two together, I mean, my legs buckled underneath me. And I reached into the freezer and I realized that was not the thing to do. So instead, I put the bottle down and I called student counseling. And I went straight into counseling. The next 20 years.
We should say a good word about Oprah.
Yes, we should.
For whatever her limitations and problems, she was very instrumental in bringing these kinds of subjects into the daily discourse prior to Twitter, right? So that when there was no Twitter, Oprah at least had the courage to begin talking about stuff like this so that victims could, like you did, put a name to it.
Absolutely. In fact, she was such a pioneer that with this topic in particular, and I do want to say that at the time that this was happening, my awareness began. My awareness of what had happened to me in the late 80s, 90s, there really were very few resources. I mean, I kept looking for information like, what does child sexual abuse do? What are the symptoms? What are the issues? What are the consequences? I could not find that information for a very long time. Oprah was the only person who addressed it. And she did that wonderful show with Tyler Perry about male survivors, where you may recall, where they all held pictures of themselves as children. Incredibly touching. It was so powerful. So yes, we must give Oprah her due. And
I hope she listens to this show. I don't know if she does or not, but it's possible.
Well, she was a fellow survivor, and she spoke, and her family welcomed her abuser, who I believe was a cousin or an uncle. He was welcomed at family barbecues. And, so again, we have this issue of not just carrying the abuse, but carrying the abandonment post-abuse, which is really, in many ways, more preventable than the abuse itself. So we do need to come back to that. But anyway, I digress. That is when I first became aware that I am a survivor of child sexual abuse. I mentioned something to my parents. My mother said, please tell me it's not true. I said, okay, it's not, and I understood she couldn't deal with it. So I was on my own. I thought in a very, very logical way, if you will, that if I had a healthy sexuality, that meant that I hadn't been damaged. So I proceeded to act as if it hadn't happened. And
what you imagined a person to whom it hadn't happened would act. Right.
Yeah. And I became very defiant that I'm not going to allow these people to take away my relationship to my sexuality. So I tried to have sex like a normal person. But in order to do that, I needed alcohol. And drinking came in.
And that's not normal.
No, it's not.
That's the point I'm making, right? Like when you are a victim of abuse, you can only pretend to act like what you think non-abused people act like, because you can't step out of your own history to know. No. And it's amazing how we sort of blind ourselves to these realities. Like, I have sex like a normal person, except I always have to have alcohol first. I mean, that's totally normal, right? And,
right.
In fact, it's not. Right.
No, and very, very naive of me to think that the only area in which I had been impacted was sexual. I mean, that's the least of it. You know, when people say, how does child sexual abuse impact a child? My response is usually, how does it not? There is no area of your development that it doesn't affect. Driving, I have a problem driving because and I discovered recently that the part of the brain that judges distance is damaged by child sexual abuse. You know, and all my life I've been mocked for being a bad driver. But yeah, so at that point, I very naively thought that if I reclaimed my sexuality, I would be cured and I would be free of the damage. Alcohol, as I mentioned, was a part of that. Alcohol was also an incredible numbing agent. Alcohol helped me deal with the ongoing, alienation from my family of origin, which was inevitable at that point. And also helped me relax. I didn't know how to be in my body. I had to leave my body to survive the abuse. So alcohol served many, many functions. And as my 20s progressed, my drinking increased. I didn't develop a full-blown alcoholism till I was about 29.
How do you define a full-blown alcoholism?
Bottle of scotch a day. Drinking in order to fill the coffee machine in the morning because my hands shook too badly to make a cup of coffee without spilling it everywhere. I drank to be normal.
Sure.
And I was not visibly drunk. I mean, I don't know who knew. I didn't imagine that no one knew. I pretty much closeted myself. A number of things happened at that point. I basically had a breakdown at 29. And I left New York City and I went back to Pakistan in order to write the memoir that I'm writing now. Instead of writing, I continued to drink, and obviously being back at my parents' home after living on my own for a decade, with all these unresolved issues, in an environment where I was not safe to talk about what had happened to me. It resulted in my drinking getting worse and worse and worse. And I was institutionalized a couple of times. I mean, it was bad. It was really bad. And at that point, I met my husband, which you can already hear the ending of this story, because my judgment was not what it should have been, and I was an alcoholic. I was impaired, so I chose very poorly, and launched a 20-year very dysfunctional marriage. Halfway through, I got sober for the time as an adult, and he did not know how to have a relationship with a person who for the first time wanted genuine intimacy and connection.
How were you able to get sober?
Pardon?
How were you able to get sober?
I never thought I would. I thought I would die an alcoholic, and that was the goal. I was consciously drinking myself to death. I lost my best friend. My best friend committed suicide. And though she wasn't an addict, she had various mental health issues. And she was a survivor of child sexual abuse at the hands of her father. And she told me once, and she never wanted to talk about it again. But once was enough.
Right.
So she committed suicide. And my favorite cousin, who was an alcoholic, had a very undignified death as well. I lost these two very important people, and I saw how others were talking about them in such disparaging terms, like poor, like they were tragic victims. And I knew their stories, and I knew what they had been up against. And I hated the idea of anyone talking about me that way. And I realized that if I drunk myself to death, then I would forever be a victim. And the fact that I was responding to something that was incredibly traumatic, and that I was not the villain of that story, would be lost, and focus would be on my addiction. I couldn't have that. And my pride kicked in. And I just literally overnight, I made a decision.
And did you stop drinking right then? You went cold turkey?
No. I was very badly physically addicted. So I went and I found the best counselor I knew. At that point, I had about 5 or 6 different psychotherapists, none of which was equipped to deal with child sexual abuse. I had, however, taken a counseling course in Pakistan run by a British psychotherapy institute that dealt with humanistic integrative counseling, which is a wonderful approach. So if you want more about that, I will tell you. But
yeah, tell us a little bit.
It's the philosophy. I find it so funny when therapists on Twitter start arguing about different modalities. Is CBT better than DBT, better than psychodynamic? Like, what I was trained in meant that you as a therapist have a paint box of different approaches. You learn about as many as possible, including, EMDR, including Reiki, including yoga, including whatever you want. Right. And humanistic counseling is very client-centered, which means that you meet the client where they are. You don't impose a therapeutic modality that you were trained in upon them. You look at them as an individual. The individual is their own expert. And you let their needs dictate which approach you use. And in one session, you may pull out a little CBT, little DBT, a little psychodynamic. You have to be very flexible and fast on your feet, but you don't impose your theoretical leanings upon your client.
And learning about this was helpful to you in your journey.
Yes, because the course that I took was focused on the connection between child sexual abuse and addiction. So it was information that I had been craving my whole life. And as you said earlier on in this conversation, having the theoretical information did not change, did not magically enable me to heal. What did enable me to heal was the therapeutic relationship. And that is a relationship that I found with my former professor from that course, who I sought out, who happened to live 20 minutes away from me in London at the time, and happened to have a slot open for a client. And I jumped on it and I started working with her. What she did with me was very simply reparenting. She identified very quickly that what I needed was maternal replacement. I needed a maternal bond with someone. And she dealt with me so carefully with such clean, firm boundaries. She handled my borderline traits. I wouldn't say I was full blown, but I had trained. She navigated that landscape so skillfully that I never turned on her. I had complete trust in her. She would come to sessions with burning fever at times. Looking back, I can remember sessions where she was very, very ill, but she would never cancel because she knew that a client like me, could not handle the abandonment. And never a minute late. But more than that, she was incredibly well versed in the connection between child sexual abuse and addiction. So it took a specialist in those two topics. And she convinced me that I had to get sober before we could begin any meaningful work together. And I did everything she asked me to.
So, and so at that point you began treatment both for the sexual abuse and the addiction, because this was my question is, you're quite clear about the role alcohol played in helping you to kind of cope with the after effects of your abuse. So it seems like that would make it very difficult to just give up the alcohol without some other means of dealing with the after effects of your abuse.
Yes. And that is where intensive, double, if not twice weekly sessions came in. My antidote to my substitution for the alcohol was awareness and ready. I was fed up of self-destructing. I became incredibly curious about how I functioned and how I had gotten in the way of me getting my own needs met. The thing about all abuse, especially childhood abuse, is that long after it's ended, we internalize the abuser and we continue to abuse ourselves. It's an extraordinary thing about human beings, the force of habit and the power of repetition compulsion. We are drawn to the familiar, even if it's killing us, because we know it's safe. So understanding how I continued to put myself in dangerous situations, how I won't say invited, but how I victimized myself and carried on creating the conditions for myself to be exploited and abused further, enabled me to, the light bulb moment of that is extraordinary, right? When you realize that you are responsible for the pattern that you thought was just your kismet, your fate, right? Yeah. It is both a terrifying and a glorious moment, because at that moment, you realize the future is in your hands, Yeah. So once I understood that, I was tremendously motivated to heal. And like I said, curiosity was a very big part of it. What I couldn't have done it without was the maternal figure, the safe, nurturing parent who held me through it. And that was my therapist. And you could say for the first time in my life, I had real mothering. And even though I was 41 when I started the counseling, it was a brand new experience for me. And we engaged in this dynamic. I knew she wasn't my mother and she knew I wasn't her daughter, but we took on these roles for the therapeutic benefit. Mm-hmm. And it was incredibly effective. I mean, it took about 4 years for me to be able to stand on my own 2 feet without her. But I'd say that's a remarkably short period of time, given all I had to unpack.
So where are things today with your book, et cetera? How is that going?
Well, the book is a bit of a challenge because every time I sit down to write, I disassociate. Mm. It's very difficult.
Write that into the text.
Yes, I'm trying to. I have a theory that we don't have a ton of great literature and movies about child sexual abuse because the people qualified to write them disassociate with. As they say, the only way out is through. So writing the book in and of itself is a challenge that I've set for myself in order to learn how to sit with the feelings, which is a lifelong process. It's ongoing. So I would say I'm about a third of the way through. And speaking of repetition compulsion, I'm going through a divorce with a partner who mirrored a lot of the abusive dynamics. So I am now recovering from that. And this process of recovery is very different than the last. I'm getting acquainted with all that I've learned because my ability to process things and heal is so accelerated now that it's a completely different experience. So unfortunately, that was, the last of the alcoholic amends that I needed to make with probably the biggest mistake made. But it's good to pay the piper. It feels good to work through the damage because I'm reminded of how far I've come and how dangerous it is to be unconscious of the consequences of what other people did to me.
That's very good. Let's say that again. It is dangerous to be unconscious.
Yeah, of the consequences of what other people did to me. And I will add to that I then learned to do to myself. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The last question here, because we've gone for a while. People who are listening to this who themselves may have experienced some level of sexual abuse or trauma, what do you want to say to them?
You're number one, you're not alone by any stretch. Number two, don't allow the reactions of the 1 or 2 people you've told who have zoned out to hold you back from confiding in others. There are people who can give you the compassion you deserve. The only way to heal, as far as I know from this, is to talk about it. And spreading awareness is so important. But most importantly, before you can do that, I think counseling is an absolute must. And I think the relief provided by the relief to be gained from letting go of the shame and share and busting the secret and is something you can't even conceive of. It is so liberating, but you'll only know when you do it. And I'm going to say one more extremely important point, because the majority of abuse takes place in educational institutions, But the second place is the child's home. And 80% of abusers are known to children, and very often within the immediate family, if not, known to the family. One of the things that gets in the way of people disclosing is a sense of loyalty to their families. And dealing with child sexual abuse almost always involves naming a parent who didn't have the resources to protect you. So we need to seriously reconsider and redefine the way we view loyalty to the family. I love my family deeply, and I'm constantly accused of not loving them because I'm very honest about their shortcomings. But I'm not willing to sacrifice myself. I'm not. And I believe that by breaking the silence, I can't talk about child sexual abuse without talking about the neglect of the circumstances that gives rise to it. I can't. Can't not talk about the abandonment of immediate family members who think that they're doing the child a favor by pretending it didn't happen and ignoring the symptoms. And we need to stop judging people for holding family members who make mistakes accountable. When we've got to stop labeling this as the height of disloyalty. We're not living in a tribal landscape anymore.
Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating talk.
You're welcome, Dean.
And people can find you on Twitter at the Wacky Packy. Tell everyone about the H.
The H? Oh, yes. The Wacky Packy, wacky spelled with an H, WHACKY. PAKI. The Packy, by the way, is cultural reappropriation of a racial slur that I was called growing up in England.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. Let's do it again sometime.
I would love to, Dean.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.